In 1910, a Chicago publisher named William Boyce got lost in a London fog. A young boy appeared, guided him to his destination, and refused payment. Boyce was so impressed that he returned to America and founded the Boy Scouts. That's the story you've been told your entire life. It's also complete nonsense. The Boy Scouts of America wasn't created because of a helpful British kid in the fog. It was created because American industrialists realized they had a problem. The children of immigrants and the working poor were starting to organize. They were forming youth labor unions. They were reading socialist literature in tenement libraries. And worst of all, they were beginning to ask questions about who actually owned the factories, the railroads, and the land their parents worked to death on. The Boy Scouts was the solution, not a character-building organization, a labor pacification program wrapped in a uniform. If you're getting value from content like this, hit that subscribe button. I'm covering the hidden economic history behind American institutions every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about what they don't teach you in history class. The year is 1909. America is in the middle of what historians politely call the Progressive Era, but what workers at the time called a war. The previous decade had seen the Pullman strike brutally crushed by federal troops. The Cold Wars had turned Appalachia into a literal battleground. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire was just 2 years away, and when it happened, it would kill 146 workers, most of them young women and girls. American children weren't going on camping trips. They were working 12-hour shifts in textile mills, breathing cotton dust that would destroy their lungs by age 30. They were losing fingers in machinery that had no safety guards because safety guards cost money. They were dying in mine collapses that happened because mine owners had decided that supporting beams were an unnecessary expense. And they were getting angry. Not the sullen, defeated anger of people who have given up. The organized, articulate anger of people who understood exactly who was responsible for their suffering. Youth socialist clubs were popping up in every major industrial city. The socialist Sunday schools were teaching 10-year-olds about surplus value and class consciousness. The Workmen's Circle was running youth programs in Yiddish, teaching immigrant kids that their parents' poverty wasn't natural or inevitable. It was designed. The people who owned America's industrial infrastructure saw this and understood the threat immediately. You can crush an adult union with Pinkertons and strikebreakers, but you can't send armed thugs to beat up a reading group for teenagers without creating martyrs and radicalizing an entire generation. You needed something subtler, something that looked wholesome. Enter Ernest Thompson Seton. Most people have never heard of Seton, but he was the original architect of what would become the Boy Scouts. Satin was a naturalist, an artist, and critically, a man who believed that American boys were being destroyed by industrial capitalism. He wrote extensively about how factory work and urban poverty were creating what he called a physical and moral degeneracy in young men. He wasn't being poetic or metaphorical. He meant it literally. He believed that wage labor was a form of slavery that was physically and spiritually crippling children. In 1902, Seton created something called the Woodcraft Indians. The idea was simple on the surface, but radical in its implications. Take working class boys out of the cities, put them in nature, teach them traditional skills that had nothing to do with industrial production, and reverse the damage that wage labor was doing to their bodies and spirits. The program taught tracking, wilderness survival, traditional crafts, and cooperative living. But it also taught something more dangerous from the perspective of factory owners. It taught boys that there were ways of organizing human society that didn't involve bosses and workers, owners, and labor. The Woodcraft Indians ran their tribes as democratic collectives. Boys voted on decisions. Leadership rotated. No one was permanent chief. This was wildly popular. Within a few years, Woodcraft Indian tribes were forming across the country, and every one of them was a small experiment in non-hierarchical organization happening right under the noses of the people who ran America's industrial machine. But here's what made the industrialists nervous. Seton was also a socialist, not a theoretical academic socialist. an actual boots-on-the-ground organizer who believed that capitalism was killing American children and needed to be dismantled. His Woodcraft Indians program included readings from socialist literature. It taught boys about cooperative economics. It explicitly framed nature skills as preparation for building a post-capitalist society. The people who ran America's trusts and monopolies looked at Satin's program and saw both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious. The opportunity was more subtle. What if you could take Satin's program, strip out all the anti-capitalist content, add a heavy dose of patriotism and obedience training, and use it to redirect working-class youth energy away from labour organising and toward hiking and knot tying? That's exactly what they did. William Boyce, the Chicago publisher, didn't stumble into creating the Boy Scouts because a kid helped him in London. Boyce was a wealthy businessman with extensive connections to American industrial leadership. He owned newspapers, which meant he shaped public opinion for a living. He'd been watching the youth labour movement with growing alarm, and he understood exactly what was at stake. When he encountered the British Boy Scout program during a business trip to London in 1909, he immediately recognised it as the perfect model for what American capitalism needed. The British Boy Scouts had been created 3 years earlier by Robert Baden-Powell, a military officer who had made his reputation crushing colonial resistance in Africa and India. Baden-Powell had used similar youth training programs to prepare boys for military service in the Boer War, where British forces had invented the concentration camp as a tool of colonial control. His scouting program was explicitly designed to instill discipline, obedience to authority, and patriotic fervour. It was militarism with a friendly face, imperialism packaged as character building. The British establishment loved it because it took working-class boys who might otherwise join trade unions or socialist organisations and turned them into enthusiastic supporters of the very system that kept their families poor. Boyce brought the concept back to America, but he needed someone to build it, someone with credibility among parents and youth workers, someone with real credibility who already had a successful program. He approached Ernest Thompson Seton. At first, Seton was enthusiastic. He thought he could use Boyce's resources and connections to expand his Woodcraft Indians program nationally. He became the first Chief Scout of the Boy Scouts of America in 1910, believing he could maintain the original spirit. He was wrong about that. Within 2 years, the conflict was impossible to ignore. Boyce and the business leaders funding the Boy Scouts wanted a program that taught boys to be obedient, patriotic, and respectful of authority. Seton wanted to teach them to question authority, think critically about economic systems, and live cooperatively. These were fundamentally incompatible visions. By 1915, Seton had been forced out of the organisation he helped create. The official reason given was administrative disputes and concerns about his management style. The real reason was that his entire educational philosophy was incompatible with what the Boy Scouts had become. Seton believed boys should learn to question authority and think critically about economic systems. The businessmen funding the Boy Scouts believed boys should learn to respect authority and accept economic systems as natural and unchangeable. These were fundamentally incompatible visions, and there was never any real doubt about which side would win. The man who replaced Seton as Chief Scout was James West. West's background tells you everything you need to know about what the Boy Scouts was really for. He wasn't a naturalist or an educator. He wasn't someone who had spent his life working with young people or thinking about child development. He was a lawyer and administrator who had made his career working for organisations that served industrial interests. Before joining the Boy Scouts, he had worked in the child welfare system, but his approach to child welfare was telling. He believed that poverty was primarily a result of moral failure, and that the solution was teaching poor children to be more obedient, more disciplined, and more willing to accept their place in the social order. His vision for the Boy Scouts was explicit and unambiguous. It taught boys personal responsibility, respect for property, and the importance of following rules set by their betters. It would prepare them to be productive workers and loyal citizens who would never question the fundamental arrangements of power in American society. The early Boy Scout handbook makes this crystal clear. Yes, it teaches camping and wilderness skills, but it also teaches an entire worldview, a worldview where hierarchy is natural, where questioning authority is presented as a character flaw, and where the greatest virtue is being useful to people who have power over you. Look at the structure of the organization itself. It's modeled directly on military ranks. Scouts aren't encouraged to make collective decisions or question their leaders. They're taught to follow the chain of command, to salute, to recite oaths of loyalty. The entire program is designed to produce boys who will be comfortable in hierarchical systems their entire lives. Now contrast that with what was happening in the socialist youth movements at the same time. Those programs were teaching collective decision making. They were teaching kids to analyze economic systems. They were explicitly preparing young people to challenge the bosses who controlled their parents' lives. The Boy Scouts was created to be the antidote to that, a way to take the same demographic of working class and immigrant boys and channel their energy into activities that posed zero threat to the existing economic order. And it worked. By 1920, the Boy Scouts had over 400,000 members. The socialist youth clubs and workmen's circle programs were in decline. A generation of boys who might have been reading Marx were instead earning merit badges in patriotism and learning that the best way to get ahead in life was to be helpful, obedient, and trustworthy to people in positions of authority. But the real genius of the Boy Scouts as a social control mechanism was how it transformed class resentment into individual moral questions. If you were poor, the Boy Scouts taught you it wasn't because you were being exploited by people who owned the means of production. It was because you hadn't worked hard enough on your personal character. The solution wasn't organizing with other workers to demand better conditions. The solution was earning another merit badge. This is the same logic that runs through every aspect of American capitalism. But the Boy Scouts packaged it for children and made it feel wholesome. It took the radical potential of youth organizing and redirected it into individual self-improvement within a system that was never questioned. Think about the merit badge system itself. On the surface, it's about learning skills and building competence. But look deeper at what it actually teaches. You don't earn recognition by working collectively with your peers. You earn it by impressing an authority figure who judges whether you've met their standards. The entire system is designed to make boys comfortable with being evaluated and ranked by people who have institutional power over them. This is perfect preparation for a lifetime of wage labor. You'll spend your career trying to impress managers and executives, hoping they'll reward you with a promotion or a raise. The Boy Scouts teaches you to want that, to see it as the natural and correct way society should work. Now let's talk about the camping component, because this is where the program gets really insidious. Americans have this romantic notion that camping and outdoor skills are inherently wholesome and character building. We imagine that learning to build a fire or identify edible plants somehow makes you a better person, more self-reliant, more capable. But ask yourself what function wilderness training actually served in early 20th century America when you strip away the romantic mythology. The country was rapidly industrializing. The western frontier had been declared closed in 1890. The era of homesteading and subsistence farming was ending. There was no economic future for American boys in knowing how to build a fire or identify edible plants. Those skills were becoming obsolete in an economy that was increasingly concentrated in factories and cities. The future belonged to wage labor, not wilderness survival. So why teach skills that had no practical application in the lives these boys would actually live? Because wilderness skills served a specific ideological function that had nothing to do with their practical utility. They created a mythology of rugged individualism that was completely disconnected from economic reality. A boy could learn to survive alone in the woods while remaining completely ignorant of how to survive in an economy designed to extract maximum value from his labor. He could feel capable and self-sufficient while being utterly dependent on whatever wage an employer chose to pay him. The wilderness training created an illusion of autonomy that made actual economic dependence easier to accept. In fact, that was the point. The wilderness skills made boys feel capable and self-reliant, which made them less likely to believe they needed collective organization or solidarity with other workers. You don't need a union if you think you can make it on your own through grit and determination. This is the dark brilliance of the Boy Scouts. It took the most appealing elements of socialist youth programs like outdoor education and cooperative living, stripped away anything that might lead to class consciousness, and repackaged it as patriotic character building. The camping trips became opportunities to practice following orders. The wilderness skills became metaphors for individual perseverance. The entire program was designed to produce young men who would be physically capable, mentally disciplined, and ideologically committed to never questioning who owned the land they were camping on. Let's look at who was actually funding this organization in its early years. The donor lists read like a directory of American industrial power: Rockefeller money, Carnegie money, funding from railroad magnates and factory owners. These weren't altruistic gifts to help poor children. These were investments in labor management. The same businessmen who were hiring Pinkertons to break strikes and funding politicians to block labor reforms were simultaneously funding the Boy Scouts. That's not a coincidence. It's a coordinated strategy. You crush adult workers who organize, and you capture their children before they learn that organizing is an option. The Boy Scouts also served another crucial function for American capitalism. It created a pipeline of young men who would be ready for military service. The program's structure, uniforms, and emphasis on obedience were all explicitly designed to prepare boys for potential military conscription. When World War I arrived in 1917, Boy Scouts were mobilized for war support activities. They sold Liberty bonds, going door to door to pressure their neighbors into financing the war effort. They assisted with recruiting drives, essentially functioning as junior propaganda agents to convince other young men to enlist. They distributed government information about rationing and war production. They served as messengers and support staff for military recruitment offices. The entire organization became a youth propaganda arm for the war effort, and this happened seamlessly because that capability had been built into the program from day one. This wasn't an accident or a temporary measure that happened because of the emergency of war. It was baked into the program from the beginning. Robert Baden-Powell, who created the original British Boy Scout program, was a military officer who designed it specifically to prepare boys for military service in defense of the British Empire. The entire concept emerged from his experience using youth training programs in colonial wars. When American industrialists imported his model, they kept that function intact because they understood something crucial about capitalism. Wars are good for business if you own the factories and railroads. Wars create massive government contracts and eliminate foreign competition. And wars require young men who have been trained from childhood to follow orders without question and believe that dying for your country is the highest form of virtue. The Boy Scout oath makes this clear. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country. Not to your fellow workers, not to economic justice, not to questioning systems of power, to God and country. And duty in this context means whatever authority figures tell you. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Does this mean that every scout leader and every parent who put their kid in Boy Scouts was part of some conspiracy? Of course not. Most people involved in the program genuinely believed they were helping boys build character and learn useful skills. They believed they were doing something good for children and for society. The genius of ideological control is that it works best when the people implementing it don't realize that's what they're doing. That's what makes it so effective and so difficult to resist. Your local scoutmaster in 1920 probably thought he was teaching boys to be good citizens and capable men. He didn't think of himself as a labor pacification agent working to prevent working class solidarity, The very idea would have seemed absurd and offensive to him. But that's exactly what he was doing, whether he knew it or not. The ideology was embedded in the program structure itself, in the merit badges and the rank system and the patrol method and the oath and the law. You didn't need to be consciously trying to prevent class consciousness or suppress labour organising. The program did that work automatically simply by teaching boys to see the world in a particular way and to value certain things over others. This is how hegemony actually functions in practice. It's not a conspiracy in a smoke-filled room where evil men plot to oppress the masses. It's 1,000 small decisions and program structures that all push in the same direction without any central coordination, toward accepting hierarchy as natural and inevitable, toward individual competition instead of collective action, toward seeing your place in the economic system as a reflection of your personal moral worth, rather than as the result of deliberate decisions made by people with power. The people implementing these systems usually believe they're doing something good, and in some individual cases, they might be. But the systemic effect is always the same. The Boy Scouts was one piece of a much larger project to transform American working class consciousness after the labour upheavals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The same period saw the expansion of corporate-controlled mass media, the professionalization of social work as a discipline focused on individual rehabilitation rather than systemic change, and the development of what would later be called human resources management as a way to diffuse workplace organizing. All of these initiatives shared a common goal: take the energy that workers and their children were directing toward questioning and challenging the capitalist system and redirect it into individual self-improvement within that system. The Boy Scouts was the youth wing of this transformation, and it was staggeringly effective. By the 1930s, socialist youth organizations in America had been almost completely marginalized. The Boy Scouts, meanwhile, had become a ubiquitous feature of American childhood. Multiple generations of boys learned that the path to recognition and success was through impressing authority figures and ascending hierarchies, not through solidarity with peers or questioning systems of power. The long-term consequences of this are still playing out. The United States has weaker labor unions and lower-class consciousness than any other developed nation. American workers are more likely to identify with their bosses than with each other. When people struggle economically, they blame themselves rather than examining structural factors. These attitudes don't come from nowhere. They're taught, and the Boy Scouts was one of the institutions doing the teaching. Here's what makes this particularly dark. The program was so successful at what it actually was designed to do that even people who recognize these patterns have trouble articulating what's wrong. If you try to criticize the Boy Scouts, you get accused of attacking wholesome childhood activities. How can you be against teaching kids camping and leadership skills? But that's not what the Boy Scouts was really teaching. It was teaching obedience wrapped in the language of leadership. It was teaching acceptance of hierarchy wrapped in the language of outdoor adventure. It was teaching that your worth is determined by authority figures wrapped in the language of personal development. And it worked so well that generations later, we still can't see it clearly. The Boy Scouts succeeded in doing what violent strike-breaking and political repression alone couldn't accomplish. It captured the imagination and energy of working-class youth and channeled it into activities that posed zero threat to the people who owned America. It made boys feel capable and accomplished while teaching them to never question the fundamental arrangement of economic power. It created generations of men who would grow up believing that hierarchy was natural, that competition was healthy, that the way to get ahead was through individual achievement rather than collective action. That's why William Boyce and the other founders of the American Boy Scouts created this organization, not because a kid helped someone in the London fog. That story is mythology, a founding myth designed to obscure the real origins and purposes of the organization. The truth is far more calculating and far more effective. American industrialists needed a way to neutralize the threat of youth labor organizing without creating martyrs or generating sympathy for radical causes. They needed something that would reach working class children before socialist Sunday schools and labor union youth programs could teach them about class consciousness and collective action. Yeah, man, they needed something that looked innocent and wholesome, something parents would actively push their children toward, something that would be praised by churches and civic organizations, something that would teach working class boys all the wrong lessons about how to respond to exploitation and injustice, something that would make them comfortable with hierarchy and obedient to authority while convincing them that they were learning independence and self-reliance. They got exactly what they wanted. The Boy Scouts became one of the most successful ideological projects in American history. It didn't just survive, it thrived. It became such a normalized part of American childhood that questioning its purpose or methods became almost impossible. To criticize the Boy Scouts was to attack childhood itself, to be against wholesome values and outdoor education. The program's real function was hidden behind layers of camping trips and merit badges and community service projects. Today, the Boy Scouts faces declining membership and financial struggles. The organization has been rocked by abuse scandals and bankruptcy. The files documenting decades of covered-up abuse cases reveal an institution that prioritized its own reputation over the safety of children. Some people see this as tragic, the end of a wholesome American institution. But maybe it's just the conclusion of a program that served its purpose and outlived its usefulness. The ideological work the Boy Scouts was created to do has been largely accomplished. Multiple generations have internalized the lessons. American workers don't need the Boy Scouts to teach them to accept hierarchy anymore. The entire culture does that now. The education system does it. The media does it. The structure of work itself does it. The Boy Scouts was just one mechanism among many, but it was effective while it lasted. The next time someone tells you about William Boyce and the helpful boy in the London fog, you'll know what they're not telling you. That story isn't history. It's propaganda designed to obscure the real origins of an organization that was created to serve specific economic and political interests. The real history of the Boy Scouts is the history of how American capitalism learned to capture working-class children before they could develop class consciousness. It's the history of how industrialists weaponized outdoor education and turned wilderness skills into tools of ideological control. It's the history of how the energy that might have gone into labor organizing was redirected into earning merit badges and ascending rank structures that prepared boys for a lifetime of accepting hierarchy and obeying authority. That's the story they don't want you to know. But now you do. If this video changed how you see American institutions, there's a lot more where this came from. Next week I'm breaking down the real origin of the public school system and why summer vacation has nothing to do with harvest season. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. And if you want to go deeper into how American economic history has been deliberately obscured, the video on screen right now covers the real reason the frontier was declared closed in 1890. It's not what your textbook told you. I'll see you in the next one.